The transport shuttle descended through Sanctum Prime's violet atmosphere, carrying Danny Carter toward what everyone assured him would be a simple, boring diplomatic assignment. He pressed his face against the window, watching the ancient city below grow larger. Spires of crystalline metal caught the light of three distant suns, throwing rainbow patterns across white stone buildings that had stood for thousands of years. Danny was not a diplomat. He was a metalworker from Ohio, who made custom knives in his garage and occasionally repaired antique swords for museums. Somehow, that qualified him to examine alien artifacts. He still wasn't sure how that worked. "Nervous?" asked Lisa Monroe from the seat across from him. She was the actual diplomat, dressed in formal clothes that probably cost more than Danny's entire workshop. Her hair was pulled back perfectly, and she carried herself like someone who had never accidentally set her own shirt on fire with forge sparks. "A little," Danny admitted. He looked down at his own clothes. Clean jeans, a button-up shirt, work boots that he had polished 3 times. "I'm just here to look at some old swords, right? Tell them if the metal is holding up okay." "Exactly. The Velcora want a human perspective on their crown blades. 7 sacred swords, preserved for over 10,000 years. Apparently they've had experts from 40 different species examine them, and they want us to be number 41. Lisa smiled. "Easy assignment. Look at the swords. Say something nice. We all have dinner. Everyone goes home happy." Danny nodded, but something in his stomach felt tight. When he had learned over 20 years of working with metal to trust that feeling, it usually meant something was about to go wrong. The shuttle landed in a courtyard of polished stone. Danny followed Lisa down the ramp, and the first thing he noticed was the heat. Sanctum Prime was hot, and the air smelled like copper and something sweet he couldn't identify. The second thing he noticed was the Velcora waiting for them. Craftmaster Geron stood 7 feet tall, with skin that looked like brushed bronze and eyes that glowed faintly amber. He wore robes of deep red marked with symbols Danny couldn't read. Behind him, 6 other Velcora stood in perfect formation, all watching the humans with expressions that might have been curiosity or might have been suspicion. Danny had never been good at reading alien faces. Ambassador Monroe, on Craftsman Carter. Geron's voice was deep and resonant, like someone speaking from the bottom of a well. "Welcome to the Grand Archive. We are honored to share our greatest treasures with representatives of humanity." Lisa stepped forward and made some kind of formal greeting that she had probably practiced 100 times. Danny just nodded and tried to look professional. He was very aware that his work boots were leaving small scuff marks on the polished stone floor. They walked through corridors lined with display cases holding weapons, armor, and tools from dozens of civilizations. Everything was perfectly preserved, perfectly lit, perfectly arranged. Danny noticed that nothing had dust on it. Nothing showed signs of age or wear. It was like walking through a museum where time had stopped. "Why, the crown blades represent the pinnacle of Velcora achievement," Geron said as they walked. "They were forged during the Age of Unity, when our people first reached beyond our world. Each blade took 50 years to complete. They have never dulled, never rusted, never failed. They are perfect." The word perfect made something in Danny's chest tighten. In his experience, nothing was perfect, especially not weapons. They entered a large circular chamber with a domed ceiling covered in star maps. In the center, on a platform of white stone, 7 swords lay in a display case made of some kind of transparent material. Soft light came from below, making the blades seem to glow. Danny approached slowly. The swords were beautiful. Each one was about 4 feet long, and with a gentle curve that reminded him of Japanese katanas, but wasn't quite the same. The metal was a silver color that seemed to shift slightly in the light, showing hints of blue and gold. The edges were sharp enough that Danny could tell from 6 feet away. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. "You may examine them," Geron said. "The case will open for you." Danny reached out, and the transparent material folded away silently. He picked up the first blade carefully, holding it the way his grandfather had taught him to hold a sword, checking the balance. It was perfect. Absolutely perfect. The weight distribution was flawless. The blade was straight without any variation. The edge was uniform along its entire length. He picked up another blade. Same perfection, then another, and another. That tight feeling in his stomach got worse. These are remarkable, Lisa said, clearly trying to prompt Danny to say something diplomatic. The preservation is incredible. Danny set down the fourth blade and picked up the fifth. He turned it over in his hands, looking at how light reflected off the metal. He tested the flex, applying gentle pressure. Nothing. The blade was rigid as a steel bar. Craftsman Carter? Geron's voice had an edge to it now. Your assessment? Danny looked up at the 7-foot-tall alien warrior, at the 6 other Velkara watching him, at Lisa, whose eyes were quietly begging him to just say something nice and not cause an incident. He looked back down at the sword in his hands. At the perfect edge, the flawless surface, the absolute uniformity of the metal. These feel wrong, Danny said. The silence in the chamber was immediate and heavy, plus Lisa closed her eyes like she was praying. Geron's amber eyes brightened, and Danny wasn't sure if that meant anger or surprise. Wrong? Geron's voice was very quiet now, which somehow felt more dangerous than if he had shouted. You examine the crown blades, artifacts that have been studied by the greatest minds of 40 species, preserved through 10,000 years without flaw, and you claim they feel wrong? Danny carefully set the blade back on its display stand. His hands were steady, but his heart was hammering in his chest. He knew how this looked. Some random human metalworker from Ohio, standing in front of legendary alien artifacts, insulting them after 30 seconds of examination. I don't mean to be disrespectful, Danny said slowly. The craftsmanship is incredible. The preservation is beyond anything I've ever seen. But something about these blades bothers me, and I can't quite explain what it is. Geron crossed his arms, and the movement made the muscles in his bronze-colored arms ripple like cables of metal. Then perhaps you should try to explain, because what you have just said is a grave insult to my people and our heritage. Lisa stepped forward, her diplomat smile fixed in place. Craftmaster Geron, I'm sure Danny simply means that human metallurgy uses different techniques. Perhaps if he could study the blades more carefully with proper equipment, he could better articulate his observations. Danny shot her a grateful look. Lisa was good at this, turning his blunt statement into something that sounded reasonable and scientific. Geron stared at Danny for a long moment. The other Velkara behind him were very still, watching. Finally, the craftmaster nodded once. Very well. We did invite you here for your expertise, however questionable it may be. What do you require? Just some basic tools, Danny said. A magnifying lens, good lighting, and permission to handle the blades more thoroughly. I won't damage them, I promise. 20 minutes later, Danny sat at a workbench in a side chamber, one of the crown blades laid out before him. A Velkara technician had provided him with equipment that made his garage tools look like toys from a cereal box. The magnifying device could zoom in until he could see the crystalline structure of the metal itself. Geron stood behind him, watching every move. Lisa stood by the door, probably calculating how badly this could damage human-Velkara relations. Danny worked slowly and carefully, examining every inch of the blade. He looked at the edge, the spine, the tang where it would fit into a handle. He studied the grain of the metal, the way light reflected off microscopic imperfections that weren't really imperfections at all, just the natural structure of forged steel. Except there was no grain, no structure, no variation at all. This is the problem, Danny said finally. He adjusted the magnifier so Geron could see what he was looking at. The metal is too uniform, too perfect. And this is a problem because… Geron's voice was still cold, but there was a hint of curiosity now. Danny sat back and tried to figure out how to explain something that he had always understood through his hands rather than his head. When humans make blades, we introduce variations in the metal. We fold it, layer it, heat different parts to different temperatures. We create a hard edge that can stay sharp, but a flexible spine that can bend without breaking. We make the metal stronger by making it imperfect. That makes no sense, one of the other Velkara said from the doorway. Imperfection is weakness. Not in metalwork, Danny replied. He pulled out his phone and started searching through his photos. Look, here's a picture of a Japanese katana under magnification. See these lines? That's where different layers of steel were folded together. The edge is hard, almost brittle, but the core is softer, more flexible. When the blade takes a hit, it can absorb the impact without shattering. He swiped to another photo. This is a Damascus steel blade from Syria, over 1,000 years old. See the pattern? That's from folding the metal hundreds of times. It creates zones of different hardness throughout the blade. Géron leaned closer, studying the images. His amber eyes flickered with something that might have been interest. These blades have survived centuries of use because they were designed to flex, to absorb stress, to handle imperfect conditions, Danny continued. Your crown blades are perfect in every way, which means they have no flexibility, no give, no way to handle unexpected stress. They have survived 10,000 years, Géron pointed out. In a controlled environment, never used, always protected, Danny said. But a sword isn't meant to sit in a display case. It's meant to be used. And I'm willing to bet that if these blades ever faced real combat stress, they would fail. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The Velcara all stiffened. You and Lisa made a small noise that might have been a whimper. You dare suggest, Géron said very quietly, that the crown blades would fail in battle? These weapons that represent the pinnacle of our civilization's achievement? Danny met the craftmaster's glowing eyes. I'm not trying to insult you or your people. I'm telling you what my experience with metal tells me. A perfectly uniform blade is a brittle blade. It has nowhere to distribute stress, no variation to stop cracks from spreading. The first time it hits something harder than itself, or bends at an unexpected angle, or experiences a sudden temperature change, it will shatter. Impossible, Géron said. These blades have been examined by experts from dozens of worlds. Advanced sensors have mapped every molecule. Yet no one has ever suggested they are anything but perfect. Maybe that's the problem, Danny said carefully. You've been using advanced technology to confirm what you already believe. But sometimes the old ways, the simple ways, can tell you things that scanners miss. Humans have been making blades for thousands of years. We've broken a lot of swords learning how to make good ones. I think we learned something in all those failures that your perfect preservation might have skipped. Géron was silent for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised Danny. Prove it. What? You claim these blades are flawed despite their perfection. Prove it. We will test one blade under conditions you specify. If it fails, I will acknowledge your wisdom. If it succeeds, you will apologize before the entire Velcara Council for your insult. Lisa stepped forward quickly. Craftmaster, perhaps we should discuss this further before— I accept, Danny said. The testing chamber was larger than Danny expected, with high ceilings and walls lined with observation windows. Word had spread quickly through the Grand Archive, and now at least 50 Velcara crowded those windows, watching. Danny could feel the weight of their stares like physical pressure against his back. Lisa pulled him aside while Géron supervised the setup of testing equipment. Do you have any idea what you're doing? She whispered urgently. If you're wrong about this, it's not just embarrassing. The Velcara will consider it a deliberate insult. We could lose trading agreements, research partnerships, everything we've built with them over the past decade. I know, Danny said. His mouth was dry and his hands felt cold despite the heat of the room. But Lisa, I'm not wrong. I can feel it. You can feel it, she repeated, her voice flat. Danny, you're betting interstellar diplomacy on a feeling. On 20 years of working with metal, Danny corrected. On knowledge passed down from my grandfather, who learned it from his grandfather, going back generations. Humans have been making blades since we lived in caves. That's a lot of accumulated experience. Lisa looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. I hope you're right, because if you're not, they're going to ask me to leave you here. Géron approached, carrying one of the crown blades on a ceremonial cushion. His face was unreadable. The blade is prepared. What test do you propose, Craftsman Carter? Danny had been thinking about this since he made his challenge. He couldn't just hit the blade with a hammer. That would be disrespectful. And besides, these blades were clearly strong enough to handle direct impacts. He needed to test the one thing he suspected they couldn't handle, the weakness that came from being too perfect. 3 tests, Danny said. First, a flexibility test. We clamp one end and apply graduated pressure to see how much the blade can bend before it takes permanent damage. Geron nodded. Acceptable. This will prove the blade's strength. Second, an edge retention test under repeated impacts. We strike the edge against progressively harder materials. Also acceptable, the crown blades have never dulled. Third, Danny said, and this was the one he was counting on, means a thermal stress test followed by a sudden impact. We heat part of the blade, then cool it rapidly, then test its structural integrity. Geron's amber eyes narrowed. Why this test? Because real combat isn't controlled, Danny said. A blade might be used in freezing cold, then near fire. It might strike an enemy's armor while the metal is still hot from the forge or cold from ice. A good blade needs to handle sudden changes without failing. There was murmuring from the Velkara watching through the windows. Geron looked at the blade on its cushion, then back at Danny. Very well, we begin. The flexibility test went exactly as Danny feared it would. They clamped the blade in a specialized vise and applied pressure slowly. The blade bent smoothly, perfectly, showing its incredible strength. It flexed further than Danny's best work could have managed, bending into an arc without any sign of stress. The watching Velkara made sounds of approval. Lisa gave Danny a worried look. You see, Geron said, perfect flexibility, perfect strength. Keep going, Danny said quietly. They increased the pressure. The blade bent further, forming a deep curve. Still no stress fractures, no signs of weakness. Danny's heart was sinking. Maybe he had been wrong. Maybe these alien materials really were beyond anything humans understood. Then they released the pressure. The blade sprang back to straight, but Danny saw it. A tiny vibration, a harmonic frequency that traveled along the metal for just a fraction of a second longer than it should have. The blade was storing stress instead of dissipating it, or holding tension in its perfect crystalline structure with no imperfections to break up the force. Did you see that? Danny asked. See what? Geron replied. The blade returned to perfect straightness. No damage whatsoever. Danny didn't argue. He moved to the second test. The edge retention test was worse. They struck the blade's edge against steel, then harder alloys, then ceramics that could cut diamond. The edge remained perfect, never dulling, never chipping. The Velkara watching began to look smug. Some were already leaving the observation windows, clearly considering the demonstration over. Lisa looked pale. Danny, she whispered, maybe we should stop. But Danny was watching the blade carefully. After each impact, that same harmonic vibration, that same indication of stored stress with nowhere to go. The blade was accumulating damage invisibly, deep in its perfect crystalline structure where no scanner would detect it, because the damage wasn't breaking bonds, it was building pressure. Final test, Danny said. They placed the blade in a heating chamber, warming just the last 6 inches of metal to a temperature that made it glow faintly orange. Then, following Danny's instructions, they moved it quickly to a cooling bath. Not water, which would have been too dramatic, but a specialized gel that dropped the temperature rapidly without the violence of quenching. Steam rose from the gel. The blade's glow faded. They removed it and locked it back into the testing vise. Now, Danny said, we apply lateral stress. A sudden impact from the side, like the blade might experience if it struck something at an angle during combat. Geron operated the controls himself. A mechanical arm drew back, prepared to strike the blade with a measured force. Nothing extreme, just a solid hit that any combat weapon should easily withstand. The arm swung forward. The impact rang through the chamber like a bell. The crown blade shattered. It didn't just crack or chip. The entire blade fractured into dozens of pieces, breaking along invisible stress lines that had been building through every test. Fragments of perfect, flawless metal scattered across the testing platform, glittering in the light like broken stars. The silence that followed was absolute. Not a single Velkara moved. Not a single voice spoke. Danny stared at the broken pieces, feeling no triumph, only sadness. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Geron stood frozen, staring at the shattered remains of the crown blade. His bronze skin had gone pale, almost gray. The other Velkara in the observation windows pressed closer to the glass. their faces showing expressions Danny couldn't read, but that felt like shock and disbelief. Lisa moved to Danny's side, her hand briefly touching his arm, a gesture of support or maybe just making sure he was still standing. Danny felt numb. He had been right, but being right didn't feel good at all. 10,000 years, Geron said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. 10,000 years we have preserved these blades, studied them, honored them, and a human breaks one in less than an hour. Craftmaster, I didn't mean, Danny started. Silence. Geron held up one hand. He walked slowly to the testing platform and picked up one of the larger fragments. The break was clean, showing the interior crystalline structure of the metal. Explain what happened. In detail. Danny took a breath. The blade accumulated stress through each test. Because the metal has no variation, no imperfections, the stress had nowhere to disperse. It just built up in the crystalline structure. When you added thermal shock, heating and cooling rapidly, it created additional stress points. The final impact was just the trigger. The blade was already ready to fail. But our sensors detected no damage after each test, one of the other Velcara said from the doorway. Because there was no damage in the way you were looking for, Danny explained. No cracks, no deformations, no broken molecular bonds. On the damage was in stored mechanical stress. It's invisible until the moment of failure. Geron turned the fragment over in his hands, studying it. And human blades do not have this weakness because of their imperfections? Right, Danny said. When my grandfather made a sword, he would fold the steel, creating layers. Hard steel for the edge, softer steel for the core. When the blade takes a hit, the force travels through these different layers and gets dispersed. The harder steel might develop tiny cracks, but they stop when they hit the softer layer. The blade bends slightly, absorbing impact, then springs back. It's not perfect, but it survives. Show me, Geron said suddenly. What? Show me how humans make blades. I want to understand this principle. If what you say is true, then we have been preserving symbols rather than wisdom. We have kept the form but lost the function. Geron looked around at the other Velcara. Bring the historical archives, the oldest records we have of bladesmithing, before the crown blades were made. Over the next several hours, the testing chamber transformed into something between a workshop and a library. Velcara technicians brought Danny basic smithing tools, adapted for his smaller human hands. Others brought ancient records, some carved in metal, others stored in crystalline data formats that projected holographic text into the air. Danny worked while Geron and a growing number of Velcara watched. He took a piece of basic steel and demonstrated the folding technique, heating and hammering, creating layers. It was crude work compared to what he could do in his own workshop, but it illustrated the principle. Each fold doubles the layers, Danny explained as he worked. 16 folds give you thousands of layers. They're microscopic, but they're there. Each boundary between layers is a place where stress can disperse, where cracks can stop spreading. A younger Velcara, introduced as Apprentice Kiran, leaned close to watch. We were taught that uniformity is strength, that any variation is a flaw to be eliminated. For some things, maybe, Danny said, but for tools that need to absorb impact, variation is survival. He plunged the hot metal into water, and it hissed and steamed. See? The outside cools faster than the inside. That creates stress. But because I folded the metal, that stress spreads across thousands of tiny boundaries instead of building up in one place. Meanwhile, Geron was reading through the ancient archives with an expression that looked increasingly troubled. Kiran, he called. Come read this passage. The apprentice moved to stand beside the craftmaster, reading the glowing text. His eyes widened. This describes the making of warrior blades before the Age of Unity. It says they would forge a blade, use it in combat, note where it failed, then melt it down and try again. Each generation of smiths learned from the broken weapons of their teachers. And here, Geron pointed to another section, this describes blades with intentional layering, flexible cores, differential hardening. All the techniques this human describes. What happened to them? Lisa asked. She had been quiet, watching everything with diplomatic caution, but now she sounded genuinely curious. Geron was silent for a moment. We became advanced. We developed scanners that could map metal at the molecular level. We created forges that could control temperature with perfect precision. We eliminated the randomness, the trial and error. We made the process perfect. And you lost the wisdom that came from imperfection, Danny said softly. Another Velcora elder entered the chamber, moving with the careful steps of great age. Craftmaster Giron, I have brought the scroll of discarded methods. You asked for any records of abandoned techniques. Giron took the offered data crystal and activated it. Lists of smithing techniques filled the air, each one marked with a reason for abandonment. Too time-consuming. Results varied. Appearance unpleasing. Not aesthetically perfect. Danny stopped hammering and looked at the list. You got rid of everything that worked because it wasn't pretty enough? We sought perfection in all things, Giron said, but his voice held doubt now. We believed that perfect form would create perfect function. We were wrong. Kiran spoke up hesitantly. Could we learn again? Could we combine our precision with these human principles? Giron looked at Danny, then at the piece of layered steel cooling on the workbench, then at the fragments of the shattered crown blade still resting on the testing platform. Yes, the craftmaster said, we will learn, and we will remember why we forgot. 3 weeks later, Danny stood in a Velcora forge that had been unused for over 2,000 years. The space was enormous, with ceiling vents that opened to the sky and a central furnace that could reach temperatures hot enough to melt almost any known metal. Dust had covered everything when they first opened it, layers of neglect that spoke of how long the Velcora had relied on automated manufacturing instead of handcraft. Now the forge was alive again. The furnace roared with heat. Hammers rang against anvils, and Danny worked alongside Giron and Kiran, teaching them techniques that human smiths had used for thousands of years while learning Velcora methods of precision and control. The temperature needs to be uneven, Danny explained, watching Giron heat a piece of metal. I know that feels wrong to you, but trust me. Hotter at the edge, cooler at the spine. Giron adjusted the heating elements with visible effort. And his whole culture had trained him to pursue perfect uniformity, and now he was intentionally creating variation. This is more difficult than I anticipated, he admitted. Not the physical work, but forcing myself to accept imperfection as a goal. It's not imperfection, Kiran said. He had taken to the human approach with enthusiasm, his young mind more flexible than the older Velcora. It's intentional variation. Every difference serves a purpose. Danny smiled. The apprentice understood. They had been working together for weeks now, combining techniques. The Velcora could control temperatures and measure compositions with a precision that amazed Danny. Humans contributed the practical knowledge of how metal actually behaved under stress, the wisdom earned through countless broken blades and failed experiments. See, Lisa visited the forge regularly, officially to observe the cultural exchange, but really, Danny suspected, to make sure he wasn't causing any more diplomatic incidents. She stood now at the edge of the workspace, watching them work with a mixture of fascination and relief. How much longer until the blade is finished? She asked. Another week at least, Danny said, wiping sweat from his forehead. We're not rushing this. The whole point is to do it right, not fast. The blade they were creating was a collaboration in every sense. It used Velcora metallurgy, metals and alloys that didn't exist on Earth combined with human smithing techniques. They had folded the metal 32 times, creating millions of microscopic layers. They had used differential hardening, making the edge hard enough to cut through Velcora armor, while keeping the spine flexible enough to bend without breaking. Every step had been documented. Every decision explained and recorded. This wasn't just about making one sword. It was about rebuilding knowledge that the Velcora had lost in their pursuit of perfection. The council has made a decision, Giron said during a break, when they sat drinking water and letting their bodies cool. The remaining 6 crown blades will stay in the Grand Archive, but we are changing how they are presented. They will be displayed as beautiful artifacts, examples of aesthetic achievement, but also as reminders of what we lost when we valued appearance over function. That seems fair, Danny said. We are also establishing a new guild, Giron continued. The Guild of Functional Craft, or its purpose will be to recreate the old techniques, to learn again how to make tools and weapons that are meant to be used, not just admired. Kieran will be one of its founding members. The young Velkara looked up, his amber eyes bright. Craftmaster, I am honored. And we would like to invite you, Danny Carter, to be an honorary member, Geron said, to continue teaching us what humanity has learned through its history of trial and error. Danny felt heat in his face that had nothing to do with the forge. I'm just a guy who makes knives in his garage. You are a bearer of practical wisdom, Geron corrected. You trusted your instincts when advanced technology said everything was perfect. You valued function over form. You taught us to see our own history differently. Even that is worth more than any amount of technical knowledge. A week later, the blade was finished. They had worked on it together, 3 smiths from 2 different worlds, combining their knowledge into something new. The blade was beautiful in a different way than the crown blades had been. Its surface showed the subtle pattern of folded steel, waves of slightly different shades that spoke of the layers beneath. The edge gleamed sharp and true, but the spine had a softer finish, revealing its flexibility. They tested it the same way Danny had tested the crown blade. Flexibility test, edge retention, thermal stress, sudden impact. The blade passed every trial. It bent and returned straight. It kept its edge through repeated strikes. It handled rapid temperature changes and sudden force without cracking or shattering. So when the final test was complete, Geron held the blade up to the light. "This feels right," he said quietly. Danny understood exactly what he meant. The presentation ceremony was held in the Grand Archive, with representatives from a dozen species attending. The new blade, which they had named Bridge, in both human and Velkara languages, was placed in a display case next to the 6 remaining crown blades. The contrast was striking. The crown blades sat in perfect stillness, flawless and untouchable. Bridge rested at an angle, its patterned surface catching light differently from every direction, looking like something that wanted to be picked up and used. Geron spoke to the assembled crowd. "We have learned that preservation without understanding is merely stagnation. We kept our greatest blades safe for 10,000 years, but we forgot why they mattered. A human craftsman, using simple tools and ancient human wisdom, reminded us that true excellence requires accepting imperfection as part of strength." Danny stood with Lisa in the crowd, feeling awkward in formal clothes he had borrowed for the occasion. Kieran stood with the other Velkara Guild members, young smiths who were eager to relearn forgotten skills. After the ceremony, as people mingled and talked, Geron approached Danny one final time. "You challenged our most sacred beliefs," the craftmaster said. "You broke one of our greatest treasures, and in doing so, you gave us back something more valuable, our heritage, understood rather than merely preserved." Danny shook the Velkara's hand, or the closest equivalent their different anatomies allowed. You were willing to question what everyone told you was perfect. That takes more courage than I had. I just said what I felt. You actually changed things." Later, on the shuttle back to Earth, Lisa sat across from Danny and shook her head with a smile. "You know, when you said those blades felt wrong, I thought my career was over." "Sorry about that," Danny said. "Don't be. You were right. And watching you and Geron work together these past weeks, that was real diplomacy. Not the kind they teach in schools, but the kind that actually matters. Building something new by sharing what each side does best." Danny looked out the window at Sanctum Prime growing smaller below them. Somewhere down there, in a newly reopened forge, young Velkara were learning to trust imperfection. And somewhere in the Grand Archive, a new blade rested beside ancient ones, showing that the path forward sometimes required remembering wisdom from the past. He thought about his grandfather, who had taught him that a good blade tells you when something is wrong if you learn to listen. He thought about all the human smiths throughout history who had learned from their failures, who had broken countless blades to understand how to make better ones. That knowledge, passed down through generations, had traveled across the stars and helped an alien species reconnect with their own forgotten wisdom. Danny smiled and closed his eyes. When he got home, he had a lot of work to do. Kieran was coming to Earth in 3 months to study